Past week, the SEC and the Big Ten met since February, what they called their advisory group, which is in essence discussing scheduling partnership. They discussed some automatic bids for the college football playoff, in particular for 2026, which is the next iteration of the college football playoff. As you know now, this is the first season with 12 teams, and based on this partnership, Greg Sankey and Tony Petiti, have decided to meet up together still, and I definitely think this is significant for a couple different reasons in terms of the short term and the long term. I think in terms of the short term effects of this, there's a couple different things to keep in mind. The SEC in general has always played 8 conference games, and they started flirting with possibly having 9 now. And if they do decide to have this Big Ten partnership, I definitely think it could definitely put a hinder on their schedule in general, because at the moment now, the Big Ten already plays 9 conference games. So you have to imagine that they're going to receive pushbacks from the likes of some of the smaller athletic directors, such as your Northwesterns, your Illinois, your Purdue's. You got to imagine there's going to be some pushback on that too, because I think part of the reason why it's good to have that sort of flexibility is because you get that intrigue of such fresh matchups. Like, for example, we wouldn't have gotten LSU and USC. We wouldn't have got Michigan versus USC. We wouldn't be getting all these sort of different, non-conference games that you typically wouldn't other. Well, Michigan and USC is a conference game, but you get my point, though. In general, just being able to sort of open up those horizons and being able to think of different stuff too. I mean, granted, a lot of the conference scheduling in general definitely is well thought out in advance, and there's certain games where you're scheduling those 3-4 years in advance to some degree, because granted, with the way that you know a college works, or you can't really you can only expand the season for so much longer. So you kind of have to ask yourself, okay, you have this window from, typically it's the somewhere in mid-August, and then you have until what, maybe the end of December or early January, depending on exactly what happens in terms of how long you want the playoff to be, or how long that their eligibility is for, because especially with the season of transferring in general, there isn't there's just less and less flexibility in terms of having the schedule too. So now the SEC and the Big Ten are kind of getting together and deciding, how can they maximize themselves in terms of the college football playoff overall. Just to reiterate too, this deal's kicking in the 2026-2027 season, but the college football playoff and ESPN agreed to a 6-year, $7.8 billion deal that will start in 26 and 27, that will run through 2031 and 2032. So I mean, you already know, just based off of that alone, when that was announced. I think it was announced earlier this year, that the playoff is just going to be indicative of pretty much all of college football, in the sense that you have to imagine that to some extent bowl games are just going to be less and less impactful. You're going to have to imagine that players are going to be de- undeclaring for the bowl games. Coaches are going to be moving quicker, because as you spread out the season more and more, the less time that you have in order to go into the transfer portal, go into recruiting during the spring. And then now you have to go into, because you're thinking to yourself, okay, now I have to learn this new playbook. Now I have to go and build rapport with the new teammates. Now, if I'm a head coach, I pretty much have to rebuild my staff every year, because you don't know if half of them are leaving for one of the assistants who got a head coaching job. You don't know if he's going to go and try to take a coordinator job when he was a positions coach. You don't know if one of your high up position coaches ends up taking a taking a different job. Like, even in Georgia State's head coach, he left to become an assistant at South Carolina. So I think part of what this advisory group is going to do, I think it's just going to kind of perpetuate the trends that we're seeing in college football, because at this point, it's smart of the Big Ten and the SEC in the sense of they know that they have all the leverage in this situation, because ultimately, you know, back in 20 years ago, like you had that even balance of when the Pac-12 and the Big 12 were legitimate. I'm not saying they're not power conferences anymore. I'm saying that the balance between the five main conferences, between the ACC, the Big 10, the Pac-12, the Big 12, and the SEC, it was a lot more. It was a lot more evenly distributed in the sense of all those schools had a couple of those programs where every conference was worth watching in some capacity. Whereas now there's nothing. I would argue, I've argued on the show multiple times, that the Big 12 is easily the most competitive conference in probably all of college football, even including the Group of Five. But at the same time, it's been dummied down to some degree. I mean, when you don't have the likes of the power schools like Texas and Oklahoma anymore, it definitely hurts a little bit. I mean, obviously, it's just the highs and lows of college football in general. But I think this advisory group is definitely going to speak volumes in a couple of ways. I think, for first of all, I mean, in terms of the scheduling partnership, it's good in the sense of, if you're ESPN, the way that you're looking at it is, okay, if the Big Ten and the SEC decide to partner up together, you got to imagine that part of the marketability of that is just being able to have such bigger games, is be able to have those bigger games consistently. Like, for example, what about, Ohio State playing Texas, for example, or you have Oklahoma playing Rutgers, or whatever that equivalent is. You're going to get a lot of those sort of fresh matchups that you otherwise would have never saw. Which, if you're a fan of the SEC or the Big Ten, that's great. For example, I mean, I think another awesome matchup would be Penn State versus Missouri, for example. Two programs that more often than not go under the radar, but yet have consistently been in that top 10, top 15 range, that otherwise get overlooked just because of how many other teams are within that conference. So when you think about it that way, I love the idea of all the matchups that you can create from it, because, you know, if if we talked about 10, 15 years ago, there's really those matchups for the most part would be essentially non-existent too, because even Missouri was in the Big 12 at one point too. So I think that part of it is a lot of fun, of being able to kind of have like a sort of fantasy, have like fantasy booking, in a sense of saying, like, what if this game could happen? What if that game can happen? 'Cause I think, as someone who loves college football, I'm definitely excited by that. Instead of having to wait until the college playoff to have those matchups, imagine having that regular season game. Because any way where you can build more of those intense regular season matchups, the more it's going to work out long term. Because, in terms of the college football schedule now, there's always a week or two where there's not that many marquee matchups. Like, you saw in the schedule this week in general. I mean, there's a couple decent games this week. I mean, in my opinion, the biggest game this week would be Missouri Texas A&M. But it goes to show that there's the highs and lows of scheduling in general, and sometimes that's just the way the cookie crumbles. But ultimately, what this could mean is that you get a bunch of those fresh matchups. I think also, in terms of this automatic bids, I think we're going to see more teams being added. I think 12 teams was kind of just like, okay, we'll start with 12, and then we'll kind of decide how we can expand this out, so we can make as much money as possible, we can sell as many games as possible. And on top of having the ESPN, I'm sure there could be other networks like TNT, like CBS, like CW Network, who already host some college football games, that are going to want a piece of the action for themselves. Like those, let's say if it ends up turning into a group of 16, having those sort of other networks who are going to want a piece of that pie as well. And the rumor that's been reported at the moment is the SEC and the Big Ten are both trying to get 4 automatic bids each. So that means that'd be 8. So I mean, having at least 8 of those tied up, and then you have to imagine that the Big Ten and the ACC would each want at least 2 each. So that's what, 16 right there. And then you got to at least add the Big 12 who's going to have 1 or 2, and then you're going to have the Group of 5 who's going to have 1 or 2. So I mean, in the sense, I'm not a huge fan of that part of it, because I think to have an automatic bid, I think it's just going to add more controversy to what's already a controversial method, in the sense of, even when it was the Group of 4, there's always going to be somebody who gets left out. You're you're kind of doing the same thing with having the automatic bids. Is okay, there might be a school who could be 9-4, but they're getting it, or 9-4, 9-3, because their conference schedule was better. But there could be a Group of 5 school that went 12-0 and doesn't get it in at all. I mean, I think back to, for example, I think of Florida State last year, who quite frankly should have got in. I think of the 2017 UCF Knights, who essentially went 12-0 and pretty much just got completely disregarded in terms of the playoff. So when you kind of think about all of this in general, I mean, you've already even seen, rumors of the college football league that they're proposing, that kind of separates the Power 5 schools from the Group of 5 schools, and essentially makes it a FBS senior and FBS junior. So already kind of seeing a bunch of different iterations of what college football can become. I don't think you necessarily need to push the panic button on this. I think the biggest thing that we're seeing from this advisory group, now that they've met once in February and once now, and there's only going to be more meetings coming up, is I think moving forward, you're going to have to anticipate a couple things. I think you're going to see more agreements between conferences in terms of scheduling, particularly if you can find a way to make it more geographically feasible for any of these teams to have fresh marquee matchups without having to travel across the country, for example, or even just having fantasy matchups. I think number two, I think you're going to receive a lot of pushback on this, particularly from the smaller schools of college football in general. So you have to ask yourself, where do you find the balance between the Big Ten and the SEC? Having for the most part control over college football, because obviously, they, after the demise of the Pac-12, and kind of the separation of the Big 12 and the ACC, all kind of having a divide over the media rights grant deal, it pretty much everything is playing in their favor. And when you have that sort of leverage on the situation, I mean, they're going to use it to the best of their ability, which is what we're seeing now. And I think, and lastly, we're all going to have to sit there and decide, how many conference games are we going to have? How many non-conference games are we going to have? I mean, the reason we're not talking about college football season having 13 or 14 games is because it's just not feasible the way that the schedule's set up. I mean, granted, you have 8 or 9 conference games right there that are automatically locked in. So you only really have another 3 to 4 open games, depending on what you have. You already know that you already know at least one or two of those games are going to be versus an FCS school or a Group of 5 school. So that really only leaves open about 2 games a year. Now, if I'm the commissioner of a school like Northwestern, or or one of those schools, I don't know why you would want one of your 2 open matchups to possibly be against an SEC school that I can possibly lose to. I mean, think about it. I mean, you don't, if you're Northwestern or something, you don't want like LSU coming in and beating you by 20. I mean, that wouldn't be very fun. But let's say if Northwestern's playing a team like Vanderbilt or something, all of a sudden, like, it's not one of those games that people are going to have marked on their calendar and say, "Oh, I'm going to sit down and watch the entire game." However, it does create an idea of at least having those sort of open matchups where you can kind of piece together some games that would be relatively even for the most part. But as long as the SEC only has 8 games instead of 9, it definitely is going to create some. It definitely can create some short term issues, because if you're the SEC, you pretty much know you are pretty much the most powerful conference of all college football. So you're kind of asking yourself too, yes, you want to have this deal with the Big Ten where you guys essentially are working together to get the most out of this college football playoff and being able to have all the advantages you possibly can. But at the same time, you it definitely listening to some of the rumors that have happened and listening to some of the comments that Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti makes, it definitely makes you stop and question what exactly is going to be the future of college football, and to what extent is it beneficial to everybody involved, not just the powerful Big Ten and SECs, but for the athletes, the coaches, the fans, and everybody too. Because at the end of the day, as much as I love college football, I do think that when you're thinking about these long term moves, that education and having a platform where it can ultimately benefit the lives of as many people as possible, to me, is what should be the most paramount when you're discussing these sort of options. But we definitely live in a day and age where money is starting to kind of supersede those sort of traditional values that you have. So moving forward here, it's to what extent are we going to see those traditions fall apart, and to what extent can you come up with a system where you find more marquee matchups and being able to expand the playoff in a way where it makes sense for everybody, not just in a sense where it's really just the group of five, it's really just the power four schools all playing each other in a round of 12 or around the 16 format, because essentially as long as these automatic bids come up, that's really what is going to end up happening.